I welcome everyone to the new part with an interesting topic. My name is Jimmy, and you are on my channel. Do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Well, we are starting. Story 1 from user Bunnyrut. Is it supposed to be good effects? Guess this kind of counts a good. When I was around 14-15, my mom needed to go to the pharmacy to pick up my brother's medication before it closed. At that time, my oldest sister would always drive. Dad had the car for work. And whenever she drove, both my brother and myself would go with her. But for some reason this time, I felt like I needed to stay home. My mom even said I should stay home. This was weird for me because I would be at home completely alone and I hated that, but I couldn't bring myself to walk out the door. So I sat down on the couch and waited for them to come home, and waited. My sister's boyfriend came flying in the door and asked where she was, then ran back out when I told him. Then my dad called me and asked who else was home. And he hung up. Then my grandparents came to the house. All the while I still had no clue what was going on. There was an accident about 15 minutes from my house. The car hit a tree and rolled 3 times. My mom was rushed to the hospital. The entire passenger side of the car was crushed in, and my mom somehow managed to unbuckle her seatbelt and throw herself on top of my sister, who wasn't wearing a seatbelt and had her window open. My mom's foot was completely detached from her ankle, held on by screws now. Her hand went out the window and her fingers were grinded down by the pavement. She has a nub for an index finger, and they had to take skin and regraft it around her other fingers. My brother always sat on the driver's side. He came out with a black eye. My sister was in shock and had whiplash, but no other injuries. I always sat on the passenger side in the back seat. I always wear my seatbelt. That was the side completely crushed in. I would have died that night. I know that. But changing one thing means that I am still here. Story 2 from user Delta0038. Ironically applying for a graduate program and stumbling into the wrong interview room. I was a straight A student in high school, working my butt off, studying several languages and taking extra courses, with the aim of getting into a prestigious university, studying the field, which I was so passionate about. I got in there, but slipped into depression, failed so many courses that I almost got expelled, and got a burnout trying to repeat all failed exams, worsening my health even further. I dropped out, lost my job, my family cut me off financially. I lived with a friend until another uni with a really bad reputation finally accepted me to let me continue my studies. The depression got worse. I was censored, living from one minimum wage temp job to another, regularly dumpster diving behind the supermarket I sometimes filled the shelves in. I eventually graduated with almost the worst possible passing GPA and applied for graduate studies, as a bachelor's degree in my field is basically worthless on the job market. 28 applications were rejected on the spot, until a prestigious university invited me to their assessment center. I originally applied ironically, as I was in the flow and thought, hey, what the heck? I was baffled, but immediately scraped together my money to buy a ticket for the 8-hour train ride, slept in the central station hall, and went to the assessment center. Having had a rough night and a long trip, I was exhausted, and in my tired state, went to the wrong interview room. The lady in there firmly asked who I was before I could turn around, and it turned out that she was the director of the program I was applying for. She told me to take a seat and interviewed me on the spot. She pulled up my CV from the database, briefly commented on my formerly assigned interviewer being censored, and then just plainly asked me what happened. I told her everything. She listened, and after 30 minutes told me the time was up, but that she found it very interesting. I walked back to the central station, angry at myself for daring to dream that I would ever be allowed into such an university again after all my ups. I was ready to take my life after my return, not being able to bear yet another failure. I walked up the stairs to the ticket vending machines when my phone rang. It was the application center, offering me a spot in the program. For a moment, the earth stood still, and I broke down crying in disbelief. I spent the next weeks extremely anxious, wondering whether I would even manage to get that degree, thinking of my past failures and my GPA. But it turned out that the program structure, curriculum, etc., were exactly what I could ever have dreamt of, reigniting my passion for my field, getting me into an upward spiral of good internships, good grades, and new friends. I regained my self-confidence and finally managed to get that depression under control. I also worked and studied up to 90 a week to make sure that I would never fail myself again. But in the end, without having stumbled into the wrong room and consequently getting a second chance by the director, this would never have happened, and I would probably not be here today. Edit. I am so very overwhelmed by all the compassion in the comments. I am really stunned. Thank you so much. I sincerely wish everybody struggling in similar situations strength and all the best. Good things do happen, and they might be just around the corner. Story 3 from user Hunter006. There's a guy that I used to know. He was the brother of a friend who I grew to know, care about, share laughs and tears with, and generally was a good influence on me. I liked him a lot, because he reminded me of me. You've ever seen the movie Sliding Doors, where one version of her makes the train and the other does not? That's what he and I were like. I was the one that, through some sheer dumb luck, had spread my wings a little, experienced things, tried things, done things. Here he was, had never had a girlfriend, never had sleep, never been to a steakhouse, and it was something that bothered him and his family too. We decided for his 22nd birthday, we would take him out to experience things and help him find his path. He'd really live life. He'd enjoy a proper steak. He'd know the loving embrace of a woman, and generally give him a year of trying new everything. Then he went to see a doctor about his cough. Ends up he had a very aggressive testicular cancer. From diagnosis to grave, 6 weeks. I've been to a few funerals to bury friends, but his was the hardest. It was 10 years ago and I still remember it like it was yesterday. I was gutted, more so than someone who didn't know him that well should have been, because I knew that it could just as easily have been me. I resolved there and then to live the life that he had been denied. Applied for a Hail Mary job at Microsoft. Got the job. It led on to bigger and better things. I also used a ton of my resources to change the world as much as I could, including working closely with a good friend of mine to launch a cancer cycling team, which has since raised over $1 million and has gone from highly experimental to nearing medical approval, needs to become a permanent and viable treatment in cancer for children. I shared this story most recently with a really great friend of mine who asked for help moving, then suddenly canceled. It ended up that he had surgery to remove a cancerous testicular growth that day. He hadn't realized that every day I wake up and try so goddamn hard in my life to make the world a better place was because of someone who was just like me died back then and never got that chance. I'll keep doing that until I die, in honor and memory of him. Story 4 from user Mind is Like a Spaceship. I was driving home to Missouri from New York and got pulled over in Ohio at about 2 a.m. I had just smoked a spliff in the car, and about 5 minutes prior I had pulled off to rail some Molly, both of which I had a pretty decent amount of in the car. The cop asked me if I knew why he pulled me over, told me I was speeding, and he had me clocked at 89 and a 70, but I knew I had been going much faster than that. Gave him my license and registration. He went to his car, came back, gave me a ticket for speeding and left, which as far as I was concerned was a supreme stroke of luck. Fast forward 2 weeks, I had spent another weekend in New York, but this time, I flew. I got very, very drunk, blacked out, missed my flight home, and paid an exorbitant amount of money to get on another flight so I could be at work the next day. I was driving to work Monday morning and was having very, very intense cravings for censored, which I had a pretty rough problem with. It was so bad I couldn't even drive and had to pull over to recollect myself. I was hating myself because I couldn't stop using, no matter how much I wanted to stop. So I looked up Narcotics Anonymous meetings that night. As I pulled up to work, I remembered my speeding ticket. I looked to see when it was due, which I figured would be a while, but the date was set for Wednesday. My boss recommended a great lawyer and called him up, and he said he'd get me in that afternoon. This guy was way out of my way and usual stomping grounds, but I needed to do something, so I went out to meet him. After I met him, I decided I'd just go to a meeting out that way, since it didn't really make sense for me to drive out of my way again to do that. So that night, I went to my first NA meeting, in an area I never would have gone to had I not needed to meet the lawyer. And here we are, 2 years and 3 months later, still clean, and still going to that same meeting every Monday night. Story 5 from user LC Anderton. Wife and I had been trying for kids for a number of years without success, several rounds of IVF, lost count of how many miscarriages, well into double figures, and we'd been turned down for adoption on the grounds that the local authorities had, and I quote, plenty of quality families to choose from. Boy, did that suck. So we're reeling from the impact of not only does insert deity of choice hate us, but also our local social workers also think we are too subpar to raise children. But that's a whole other story in itself, and more to do with the fact I said I would struggle to sit down with a birth parent who had vulgar abused their child. So one day, while feeling a bit down, we popped into a local sandwich shop where we'd been going for years. On this occasion, there was a tiny handwritten note on the wall saying, "Parrot for sale." I half-jokingly said to my better half, "I've always wanted a parrot." A little reminiscent of the way in which Homer Simpson says to Marge he's always wanted to do a thing. In part, it was also something my father always used to say, although he'd joke that he wanted a three-legged parrot as a talking point. And so it was partly a way of me trying to make a connection with my dad, who died quite a few years before. We were never really close, but I still missed him. So rather dubiously, my better half, humoring me, says, "Okay, we'll take a look." She knows that the quickest way to get me to do something unwise is to say, "You can't do that." It's pretty much guaranteed I'll then do it, has caused numerous incidents over the years, but I digress. So I call the number, and we arrange to go see the parrot. When we get there, the bird is not a shining example of how to look after your pet avian. His beak is falling apart, his feathers are mottled, he's aggressive and afraid at the same time, and his diet consists mostly of shortbread biscuit, because he really likes it. Because as you know, feeding an animal a diet that is predominantly fat and processed sugar is obviously good for it. I asked, "Why are you selling him?" They said, "Bored with it, girlfriend wants a dog instead." At which point wife says, "Get him in the car now that bird isn't staying here." So we are now the parents of one insecure and somewhat unhealthy parrot. After much reading and huge veterinary bills, he starts to improve, so Chester the parrot effectively became our child. It's amazing how like children they are between. Then one day, about a year later, he gets sick, really sick, collapsed, staggering about, loss of control. Sick local vet is clueless. To be fair, they're your standard cat and dog variety, and not specialists. An injection of vitamins and antibiotics does nothing. So next morning, wife frantically starts phoning around to discover there's only 3 parrot specialists in the UK. Apparently one in London, one in Edinburgh, and the other about an hour and a half's drive away. After describing Chester's symptoms, vet says, "Get him here now." So I drop everything at work, and it's a blue light drive across country. Vet is an amazing woman, still a woman retired as a vet. Spent the whole afternoon sorting out Chester, and while doing the vet stuff, gets talking to my other half, and they start talking about kids, and my wife explains how Chester is kind of our substitute, and they really hit it off. Chester survives. We discover that he has some kind of avian meningitis, and we head home. Next day, wife suddenly says, "I'm going to ring every adoption agency in the country until someone will speak to us." Seems her long talk with the vet had inspired her to try again. "Let's do it," says I. So we made a list and started at the top. Very first one we spoke to said, "We'd love to come and meet you tomorrow." And they did, and it was a very positive experience, and we ended up in the adoption program. As the year progresses, Chester is still very ill, but he's hanging in there and showing some signs of improvement, and we're going through the adoption process, which is harrowing and incredibly invasive. But, as it eventually results in us being accepted as potential adoptive parents, ultimately worth it. We're matched with 2 amazing children who eventually come to live with us in Chester. The kids love Chester. They even have toy Chester parrots that they cuddle in bed. And then Chester died suddenly. Only a few weeks after the kids arrived, despite the apparent improvement, the illness finally won. As my wife said, "It's like he had a job to do, to make sure those 2 wonderful children ended up where they were supposed to be, and then when his job was done, it was time to go." The vet explained the meningitis was probably there from birth, and it was only a matter of when, not if. So several years down the line, we are a very happy family, with two beautiful and amazing children who were rescued from abuse and neglect, all because of a sick parrot Christmas Eve, 2 nights ago. And my youngest says, "I miss Chester Daddy." So do I, sweetheart. So do I. Thanks to everyone who watched to the end. See you in the next video. Bye-bye.